Before we begin, if you find value in this deep dive into forgotten history, take a moment to like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I'm always fascinated to see this community span the globe. Phone on silent, lights dimmed. Let's descend. The year is 1403. In a stone building just beyond the walls of London, a man walks through corridors that smell of unwashed bodies and despair. His name is Peter Taverner, though most call him Peter the Porter. He carries keys that jingle against his hip, keys that unlock doors most Londoners will never see. Behind those doors, 6 men, chained, confined, deemed mented capti by the commissioners who inspected this place just days ago. Insane. The inventory is precise. 4 pairs of manacles, 11 chains, 6 locks, 2 pairs of stocks. Cold iron, stone walls, no windows that open to the world. This is the priory of St. Mary of Bethlehem, and Peter Taverner is stealing from it. Not gold, not silver, something more essential. Food meant for the inmates, clothing, firewood, the basic mercy owed to those who cannot speak for themselves. When the commissioners discover his embezzlement, the scandal will echo through the courts of London. But by then, something else has already taken root. A pattern, a precedent. 6 men in a building that was never meant to hold them. This is the first documented corruption within walls supposedly built for care. It will not be the last. By the year 1900, hundreds of thousands will be confined in institutions that borrowed this model. The word Bedlam itself, a corruption of Bethlehem, will become synonymous with chaos, with madness, with places where reason goes to die. What started as refuge became prison. What began as 6 men became an empire of confinement. How did places meant to heal become places of suffering? Why did the entire Western world embrace this system for over 500 years? What happened to the people locked inside? And when it all came crashing down in the 1960s, when the doors finally opened and the asylums emptied, where did everyone go? To understand what these institutions became, we must return to the moment they were born, to a time when madness was not medicine, but mystery, to a priory on the outskirts of London, and to the choices made there that would shape centuries. This is where it began. The land was a gift. On a day in October 1247, during the reign of Henry III, Simon Fitzmary stood in Bishopsgate, just beyond the city walls of London, and decided what to do with his wealth. Fitzmary was not a lord, not nobility. He was a merchant, a former sheriff, an alderman who had risen through trade and governance. He belonged to the Bethlemites, a Catholic order that had dispersed across Europe from the Middle East at the end of the Crusades. Men who remembered Bethlehem, the holy city, and sought to carry its name into the world. What he donated was land and money, a small patch of earth that would become the priory of the new order of Our Lady of Bethlehem. 2 acres, perhaps less. A single story surrounding a courtyard with a chapel at its center, approximately 12 cells, a kitchen, staff quarters, an exercise yard. The architecture was humble, functional, unremarkable. It stood roughly where Liverpool Street Station exists today, a site lost beneath centuries of London's expansion. The priory's purpose was clear: shelter for traveling pilgrims making their way through England, a collection point for donations that would be sent back to the Mother Church in Bethlehem, a node in a network of faith and fundraising that stretched across Christendom. It was not built for the insane. The monks who lived there followed their order, took in the sick, the poor, those with nowhere else to turn. This was charity, not medicine, compassion, not treatment. For over a century, this is what the priory of Bethlehem remained, a way station, a refuge, a footnote in the religious landscape of medieval London. But institutions, like people, drift from their origins. Somewhere between the founding in 1247 and the visitation of 1403, the priory began accepting a different kind of guest, those whose behavior frightened families, those who spoke to voices no one else could hear, those who could not be kept at home, could not be managed in the parish, could not be explained, the mad. We do not know exactly when this shift occurred. There is a claim, unsubstantiated, that residents of a building called the Stone House at Charing Cross were transferred to Bethlehem in the 1370s. Perhaps earlier, perhaps later. What we know with certainty is the record from 1403, 6 men, mente capti, and the corruption of Peter the Porter. By the turn of the 15th century, the priory had changed. The inventory from the 1403 visitation tells a story the monks likely did not intend to preserve. 4 pairs of manacles, 11 chains, 6 locks, 2 pairs of stocks. These are not the tools of compassion. These are instruments of restraint, of containment, of control. The men held there were not pilgrims. They were prisoners of their own minds and prisoners of the priory that claimed to shelter them. We know nothing of their names, nothing of their stories, nothing of what brought them to those cells or whether they ever left. The historical record cares only for the scandal that surrounds them. Peter Taverner, the hospital treasurer, was found guilty of embezzlement and theft of hospital property. He had been taking what little the priory received, meant for the care of its inmates, and pocketing it, food, supplies, money. This was not a man overcome by circumstance. This was systematic exploitation. The commissioners who investigated did not shut down the priory. They did not free the 6 men. They removed Taverner from his post and moved on. The priory remained. The 6 men remained, and with them a precedent. If those charged with protection could exploit instead, what hope existed for the confined? The question would echo across centuries unanswered. By the 16th century, the priory of Bethlehem was struggling. A succession of corrupt bishops and keepers had sold off its land, piece by piece. The buildings fell into disrepair. The surrounding neighborhood, once respectable, had become known for crime and poverty. Bethlem, as the locals now called it, was a byword for chaos before it ever formally specialized in madness. In 1346, the City of London had agreed to take administrative control, a pragmatic move to prevent the priory's collapse. But it was Henry VIII, nearly 2 centuries later, who would cement its future. In 1546, the Lord Mayor of London, Sir John Gresham, petitioned the Crown to grant Bethlem fully to the city. Henry VIII resisted, reluctant to cede Crown property. But in 1547, after Henry's death, the petition was honoured under Edward VI. The Crown retained legal possession of the hospital, but the City of London received the custody, order and governance of the institution and its occupants and revenues. It was an odd arrangement, one that would persist for 400 years. More significant was the decision made about administration. After a brief interval under the Governors of Christ's Hospital, Bethlem was placed under the joint management of the Governors of Bridewell. Bridewell was not a hospital. It was a house of correction, a prototype prison at Blackfriars where vagrants, petty criminals, and the morally suspect were sent to be reformed through labor and punishment. The merging of mental illness with correction, with punishment, with criminality began here. It was not accidental. It was administrative convenience. Two institutions with similar populations, similar needs for containment, similar goals of order. Why not manage them together? The consequences of that decision would reverberate through the treatment of the mentally ill for centuries. If asylums and prisons shared governance, shared philosophies, shared methods, then the mentally ill were not sick. They were deviant, disobedient, in need of discipline. The pattern set at Bethlem would spread across Europe, across the Atlantic, into the bones of every asylum built in its wake. At some point, near the end of the 16th century, Bethlem began opening its doors. Not to doctors, not to reformers, to tourists. The exact date is debated. Some historians point to 1598, when there is circumstantial evidence that the Bridewell governors may have authorized public visits as a means of raising income. Others suggest it was earlier, that the practice simply went undocumented. What is certain is that by the early 17th century, visiting Bethlem had become a form of entertainment in London. For a small fee, or sometimes for free, Londoners could walk through the wards and observe the inmates, watch them rave, watch them weep, watch them stare at walls or shout at phantoms only they could see. In 1522, Thomas More wrote in his treatise, The Four Last Things, about seeing a man in Bethlem laugh at the knocking of his head against a post. More occupied official positions that brought him near the hospital, and he lived nearby. His visit could have been professional, but his observation is casual, almost amused, a curiosity, a spectacle. By the early 1600s, the spectacle was formalized. Londoners would brave the pickpockets and robbers of the Bishopsgate neighborhood, a dangerous area few visited by choice, simply to see the show. The loonies, as they were called, the mad, the broken. This was the era when deformity, disease, and suffering were considered valid forms of public entertainment. Scars from smallpox, amputations from war, birth defects displayed in traveling shows. Bethlem fit neatly into that economy. The inmates performed whether they wished to or not. Their madness was the price of admission, and the priory profited. This practice did not horrify London society. It was accepted, normalized, expected. For over a century, Bethlem functioned simultaneously as hospital and human zoo. By the mid-17th century, the old priory could no longer stand. It was, in the words of inspectors, very old, weak, and ruinous, built atop sewers that frequently overflowed, flooding the wards with filth. The structure itself was collapsing, unsafe for either keepers or inmates. London had just survived the Great Fire of 1666, which had consumed much of the city. In the rebuilding, there was ambition, a chance to construct something grand. Robert Hooke, one of England's foremost architects, was commissioned to design a new Bethlem in Moorfields, an impoverished area north of the city, where refugees from the Great Fire had settled in makeshift camps. These camps were eventually cleared, the poor encouraged or forced to leave London entirely or move east into the growing slums. Once the land was emptied, Hooke built his masterpiece. Completed in 1676, the new Bethlem was magnificent. A Baroque palace in the French style, sprawling and symmetrical. Commentators compared it to the Palace of Versailles. It became the third largest civic building in all of Britain. At the entrance, 2 stone statues greeted visitors. They were the work of Gaius Gabriel Schibber, a renowned sculptor. One statue depicted raving madness, a man in agony, muscles tensed, face contorted. The other showed melancholy madness, a figure slumped in despair, hollow-eyed, defeated. The symbolism was not subtle. King Charles II himself officiated at the opening in July 1676. A grand ceremony, a celebration of England's rebirth after plague and fire. The public was split in their interpretation of this massive edifice. Some saw it as a triumph, a symbol of Britain's resilience and enlightenment. A nation that could build such a hospital must be a nation that cared for its vulnerable. Others wondered why such expense and grandeur had been wasted on the mad. Both perspectives missed the deeper truth. The building was beautiful. The care within was not. The new Bethlem had more capacity than the old. More cells, more chains, more patients. Public visiting continued. In fact, it intensified. The new location in Moorfields made it easier to reach, and the spectacular architecture drew even larger crowds. By the early 18th century, Bethlem was one of London's premier attractions. Visitors came from across Europe to marvel at the building and gawk at the inmates. In 1733, the artist William Hogarth painted Bedlam, the final scene in his series, A Rake's Progress. The series traced the fall of a fictional character, Tom Rakewell, heir to a wealthy merchant who comes to London, wastes his fortune on luxury, prostitution, and gambling, and ends up first in debtor's prison, then in Bedlam. The final image shows Rakewell in a cell, surrounded by other mad inmates, while well-dressed ladies peer through the bars, observing him with mild curiosity. The painting was satire, but it was also documentation. This was Bedlam. This was what it meant, the lowest point a person could reach, the ultimate disgrace. And the word itself, Bedlam, entered the English language as a noun meaning uproar, confusion, chaos, a place where order dissolved. By the end of the 17th century, the model was complete. Bethlem had evolved from a small priory into a massive institution, from a place of occasional refuge to a permanent warehouse for the mad, from private misery to public spectacle. The pattern it set would spread. In Spain, hospitals for the insane were established in Valencia in 1407, Zaragoza in 1425, Seville in 1436, Barcelona in 1481, Toledo in 1483. Each borrowed elements from Bethlem's example. In the Netherlands, Het Tolhuis was established in Haarlem in the 16th century. It would operate as an asylum for over 400 years. Across Europe, the idea took hold. Madness required confinement. Institutions could contain it. Families could be relieved of the burden. Society could be protected. The methods were uniform. Chains to prevent violence, isolation to prevent disturbance, minimal care to minimize cost. The justifications were simple. These people were dangerous, unpredictable, beyond reason. Locking them away was not cruelty. It was necessity. But necessity, repeated often enough, becomes tradition, and tradition unquestioned becomes truth. By 1700, asylums existed across the Western world. They were permanent fixtures, accepted features of civilized society. And no one questioned whether they worked. No one asked if the people inside ever got better. No one counted how many died in those cells, forgotten. The system was built. The doors were locked. The keys were held by men like Peter Taverner, men who saw opportunity in suffering, profit in confinement. And the chains remained. What would it take to break them? That question would not be asked for another century. But when it finally came, when the voices of reform began to whisper through the stone corridors of Europe's asylums, they would face a system that had stood for 500 years, a system that believed itself eternal. The 18th century arrived with a question no one was asking. Across Europe, tens of thousands were locked away. In Paris, in London, in Vienna, in Amsterdam. The asylums multiplied. The populations grew. The methods remained unchanged. Chains, isolation, cold stone cells. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. Not in the asylums themselves, not yet. In the universities, in the salons, in the minds of philosophers who dared to reconsider what humanity meant. The Enlightenment was unfolding, though few recognized it would touch even the mad. In the early 1700s, the treatment of the insane had calcified into doctrine. Madness was a failure of reason, since reason defined humanity. Those without it were less than human. Not quite animals, but not quite people either. Something in between, something to be managed, not understood. The treatments reflected this belief. Bleeding. The theory held that imbalance of the humors caused insanity, so blood must be drawn to restore equilibrium. Patients were bled, weekly, sometimes daily, until they were too weak to resist their keepers. Purging. Violent emetics forced vomiting. Harsh laxatives induced diarrhea. The body must expel whatever poison corrupted the mind. Blistering. Hot irons or caustic chemicals applied to the skin to create burns. Pain, the thinking went, could shock someone back to sanity. Ice baths. Patients submerged in freezing water until they lost consciousness. The shock to the system might jolt reason back into place. Rotation therapy. Patients strapped to chairs or boards and spun rapidly until they vomited, sometimes until they lost consciousness. Disorientation as treatment. These were not the inventions of cruel men. They were the best medicine of the age, applied with conviction by physicians who believed they were helping. The results were predictable. Patients weakened. Patients died. Patients never recovered. But the treatments continued, because the alternative was to admit ignorance, to confess that medicine had no answer for madness, that doctors were as helpless as the families who brought their loved ones to asylum gates. Across Europe, the asylums filled. By mid-century, they held not hundreds, but thousands, not just in capitals, but in provincial towns. Every region needed one, every city built one. The architecture varied, the methods did not. But philosophy, unlike buildings, is not fixed in stone. In England, a physician named William Batty was watching Bethlem with growing alarm. Batty had trained in medicine at Cambridge, studied in Europe, and returned to London with ideas that clashed with the conservative regime at Bethlem. He took a position at St. Luke's Hospital for Lunatics, a newer institution that aimed to compete with Bethlem's monopoly. In 1758, he published a slim volume, a treatise on madness. The treatise was, on its surface, a medical text, a discussion of symptoms, causes, and treatments. But it was also a direct critique of Bethlem and the practices that had become standard across England. Batty argued that mental disorder originated not from demonic possession, not from moral failing, but from dysfunction of the material brain and body. Physical causes, physical effects. If the cause was physical, then the treatment should be physical but not punitive. He advocated for what he called management. Each patient required individual assessment, individual care. His recommendations were revolutionary for the time. Cleanliness. Patients should be bathed regularly, kept in clean clothing, housed in clean spaces. Good food, proper nutrition, not the scraps and gruel that most asylums provided. Fresh air, ventilation, access to the outdoors, distraction. Patients should be separated from the chaos of family and familiar surroundings that might reinforce their delusions, new environments, new routines, and crucially, no barbaric treatments, no chains unless absolutely necessary for safety. No public spectacle. Batty's treatise was read widely, debated, criticized. Bethlem's governors ignored it. But the ideas took root elsewhere, in private asylums run by progressive physicians, in the minds of younger doctors who questioned the old ways. The question Batty posed was simple but devastating. If we claim to treat the mad, why do they never get better? The answer, unspoken but understood, was that treatment and confinement were not the same thing. Asylums confined. They did not treat. Batty offered an alternative, but one man, one hospital, one book could not overturn centuries of practice. What was needed was proof, demonstration, a model that worked. That would come, but not from England. Paris in the early 1790s was a city consuming itself. The French Revolution had erupted in 1789, overthrowing the monarchy, beheading King Louis XVI, descending into the Terror. Blood ran in the streets. Paranoia gripped the populace. Guillotines worked daily. In this chaos, few paid attention to the Hospice de Bicêtre. It sat at the gates of Paris, an ancient institution that had once been a granary, then a hospital, then a catch-all for society's unwanted. By 1793, it housed approximately 4,000 men, criminals, petty offenders, syphilitics, pensioners, and in the 7th ward, 200 men deemed insane. They were chained to the walls. Some had been chained for 30 years, 40 years, so long that the iron had worn grooves into their flesh, scars that would never heal. This was where Philippe Pinel arrived in August 1793. Pinel was 50 years old. He had trained as a physician, but spent years teaching mathematics, translating scientific texts, writing articles to survive. He had visited private asylums, observed treatments, developed theories, but he had no institutional power, no authority to change anything. His appointment to Bicêtre came through connections with revolutionaries, men who believed the new France should extend compassion even to the mad. It was a test, an experiment. Pinel arrived with ideas, but no illusions. The institution was massive, overwhelmed, underfunded. The revolutionary government was distracted by war and internal purges. But he had an ally he did not expect. Jean-Baptiste Poussin. Poussin was not a doctor. He had been a patient at Bicêtre himself, treated for scrofula, and cured. Following a pattern common at the time, he and his wife, Marguerite Joblain, had been recruited onto the staff. Poussin was now the head of the mental ward, and he had been quietly revolutionizing it. Poussin did not believe in chains. He did not believe in violence. He did not believe the mad were beyond reach. He believed in observation, in conversation, in patience. When Pinel arrived, he did something unusual for a physician. He apprenticed himself to Poussin. He watched. He learned. What he saw was a strict, non-violent management of patients. Poussin spoke to them daily, learned their patterns, understood their triggers, removed restraints when possible, used straitjackets only when absolutely necessary, and then for the shortest time. He treated them not as animals, but as people who were suffering. Pinel called this approach moral treatment, though a better translation of the French traitement morale would be psychological treatment. It was not about morality in the sense of right and wrong. It was about morale, the psychological state. Pinel began visiting patients daily, taking detailed notes, assembling case histories. He wanted to understand the natural progression of mental illness. When did symptoms appear? What events preceded them? Did the illness follow patterns? This was clinical observation, not philosophy. He documented everything over 2 years. And in 1797, Poussin made the decision that would become legend. He removed the chains from the men at Bicêtre. Not all at once, not recklessly, patient by patient, carefully, with observation and assessment. The Revolutionary Committee had warned against it. Unchain the mad, and they would turn violent. They would harm themselves, harm others, escape. Poussin unchained them anyway. And they did not riot, they did not attack. Some wept. Some stood in disbelief, rubbing wrists that had known only iron for decades. Some simply sat, stunned, unable to process freedom they no longer understood. Vicar, gods waited for chaos. It never came. In 1795, Pinel was appointed chief physician at the Hospice de la Salpêtrière, the women's counterpart to Bicêtre. It was even larger. Approximately 7,000 patients. Most were elderly, indigent, physically ill. But among them were women deemed insane, confined in wards that mirrored the brutality of Bicêtre. Pinel brought Poussin with him. Together, they repeated the experiment. Observation, conversation, documentation. And in 1798, 3 years after Pinel's arrival, the chains came off at Salpêtrière as well. This time, Pinel received the credit, though Poussin again did the work. The legend that grew around Pinel was deliberate. His son, Scipion Pinel, and his pupil, Esquirol, were both solidists, focused on biological psychiatry and brain disease. They were embarrassed by Philippe's emphasis on psychological processes, so they crafted a myth. The myth of Pinel, single-handedly liberating the insane from their chains at Bicêtre in 1793, petitioning the Revolutionary Committee, standing up to tyranny. Paintings were commissioned, prints were made. The image spread across Europe. Pinel, the great emancipator, removing chains in a single heroic act. The reality was more complex. Pinel was not at Bicêtre until August 1793. Poussin removed the chains in 1797. Pinel went to Salpêtrière in 1795, and the chains there were removed in 1798. But myths are more powerful than facts. What mattered was not who did it, but that it was done, and that it worked. Pinel published his findings in 1801, Traité médico-philosophique sur l'aliénation mentale, translated into English in 1806 as A Treatise on Insanity. In it, he argued that mental illness was often curable, that patients required careful observation, individual case histories, psychological understanding. He rejected bloodletting, purging, and blistering. He advocated close doctor-patient relationships, humane conditions, hope. His book had enormous influence. It spread across France, to England, to the United States. The idea that madness could be understood, could be treated without brutality, could even be cured. This idea was radical, and it worked. Or it seemed to. Pinel documented cases of patients who improved, who were discharged, who returned to their lives. Not all. Perhaps not even most. But enough to suggest that the old ways were not inevitable, that chains were not necessary, that compassion was not weakness. A threshold had been crossed. While Pinel worked in Paris, a Quaker merchant in England was coming to similar conclusions through different means. His name was William Tuke. In 1791, a fellow Quaker, Hannah Mills, was admitted to the York Lunatic Asylum. She died there weeks later under circumstances the family found suspicious. Tuke, disturbed, began investigating the conditions at York. What he found horrified him. Patients chained in dark cells, beatings, starvation, Isolation. The asylum was supposed to be an improvement over Bedlam, a regional institution that followed modern principles. But it was a warehouse, just like all the others. Tuke resolved to create an alternative. In 1796, he founded the Retreat in York, a small facility on the outskirts of the city. Peaceful countryside, gardens, fresh air. The retreat was designed around Quaker principles. Every person possessed an inner light, a divine spark. Even the mad were not beyond redemption. They required not chains, but community, not punishment, but purpose. Tuke's approach, which he called moral treatment independently of Pinnell, emphasized meaningful work. Patients helped with gardening, cooking, cleaning. Labor was therapeutic, gave structure, created purpose. Recreation, walks in the gardens, music, reading, activities that engage the mind. Kindness. Staff were trained to speak gently, to listen, to treat patients with respect. Family atmosphere. The retreat was small by design. Staff ate with patients. Everyone knew each other's names. No chains, no manacles, no isolation cells. Restraints were used only as a last resort, and then only soft restraints like straitjackets, never iron. Tuke was not a physician. He did not approach this as medicine. He approached it as morality, as faith, as human decency. And it worked. Patients at the retreat improved. Some recovered. Families reported their loved ones returning with clarity, with calm, with hope. Word spread. In 1813, Tuke's grandson, Samuel Tuke, published Description of the Retreat, a detailed account of the facility's methods and philosophy. The book was widely read in England and America. It became a manual for reform. The York Retreat became a model, a proof of concept that asylums did not have to be prisons. By the end of the 18th century, two parallel movements had emerged. In France, Pinnell's medical approach, observation, classification, understanding mental illness as a disease, with symptoms, patterns, potential cures. In England, Tuke's moral approach, compassion, community, labor, treating patients as people who had temporarily lost their way but retained their humanity. Both rejected chains, both rejected brutality, both emphasized individual care over mass confinement. But they differed in fundamental philosophy. Pinnell asked, what is the nature of mental illness? How does it progress? Can we categorize it, understand it, treat it scientifically? Tuke asked, how should we treat our fellow human beings when they suffer? What environment allows them to heal? One was medicine, the other was morality. The question that would dominate the next century was which approach would prevail, or whether they could coexist, or whether both would be swallowed by something darker. The sheer scale of the problem. Because even as Pinnell and Tuke demonstrated that small numbers of patients could be treated humanely, the populations of asylums across Europe were exploding. The methods that worked for 50 patients, or 100, would be tested on thousands. And the question remained, could kindness truly replace coercion when the numbers became overwhelming? The story of Pinnell removing the chains became one of the founding myths of psychiatry. It was painted by Tony Robert Fleury in the 19th century, Pinnell at the Salpêtrière, ordering the removal of chains from a kneeling woman surrounded by other inmates, while officials look on. The image is powerful, symbolic. A single moment of enlightenment breaking through centuries of darkness. But like all myths, it simplifies. Poussin removed the chains, not Pinnell. It was not a single dramatic moment, but a careful, gradual process. It happened at Bicêtre first, then Salpêtrière, and it didn't immediately transform French psychiatry. Most asylums in France continued using restraints for decades. Pinel's methods spread slowly, resisted by conservative physicians who saw moral treatment as soft, unscientific, naive. But the myth mattered because it gave hope. It suggested that change was possible, that one person with conviction and courage could challenge a system that seemed eternal. The chains could be broken, not everywhere, not all at once, but somewhere, by someone. The question was whether the momentum could be sustained, whether the reforms in Paris and York could spread across Europe and the Atlantic, whether the next generation would build on this foundation or let it crumble. The answer would be determined not in Europe, but in a young nation across the ocean, in America, where vast wilderness and limitless ambition would collide with the same question that haunted Bethlem, Bicêtre, and every asylum that came before. What do we owe the mad? And who decides? The ideas crossed the Atlantic slowly. Books, letters, travelers who had visited the York retreat or heard of Pinel's reforms in Paris. By the early 1800s, a handful of Americans were asking whether their young nation might do better than Europe had done, whether they could build asylums that actually healed. It was an optimistic question. America in 1800 was still finding itself, still expanding, still defining what kind of country it would become. The mentally ill, like so many vulnerable populations, existed in the gaps. Before the reformers, there was only improvisation. In colonial America, families cared for their mentally ill relatives at home, in attics, in cellars, in back rooms where neighbors would not see or hear them. Those without family had nowhere to go. Some wandered, begged for food and shelter, became fixtures in town squares, objects of pity or mockery or fear. Others ended up in almshouses, where the poor, the elderly, the sick, and the insane were all mixed together in squalor. Still others were locked in jails, treated as criminals, simply because no other institution would take them. There were exceptions, rare ones. In 1773, the Williamsburg Hospital was founded in Virginia, initially called the Public Hospital for persons of insane and disordered minds. It was the first public facility in America dedicated specifically to the mentally ill. The treatment was based on the theories of Benjamin Rush, often called the father of American psychiatry. Rush believed mental illness had physical causes, imbalances that could be corrected through aggressive intervention, bloodletting, gyrators that spun patients until they vomited, tranquilizer chairs that immobilized patients for hours, sometimes days. Rush meant well. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, a man of Enlightenment principles, but his treatments were medieval. Then, in the 1810s, something shifted. Quakers in America, inspired by William Tuke's York retreat, began building their own institutions based on moral treatment. In 1817, the Friends Asylum opened in Frankfort, Pennsylvania. In 1821, the Bloomingdale Asylum opened in New York City, on what is now the Upper West Side. Both were small, both were private, both catered to families who could afford to pay. But they offered something new, hope that recovery was possible. Patients lived in rural settings, worked in gardens, ate with staff, were treated with kindness. Early results were promising. Some patients did recover. Some returned to their families, to their lives. But the capacity was tiny, a few dozen beds, waiting lists that stretched for months. For every patient admitted, hundreds remained in jails and almshouses. The reformers had proven the concept. Now came the harder question. Could it scale? Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride believed architecture could heal. He was the superintendent of the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane. And he had studied the York Retreat, read Pinnell's treatises, absorbed the philosophy of moral treatment. But he was also an architect at heart, a planner, someone who thought in systems. In the 1840s, he began designing what he believed was the perfect asylum. The Kirkbride plan, as it came to be known, was precise in every detail. The building would be linear, a central administration building with wings radiating outward in a shallow V-shape, like wings of a bird. Each wing would have multiple wards arranged hierarchically. Patients would progress through the wards as they improved. The most disturbed would be farthest from the center, the most recovered closest to discharge. Movement through space would mirror movement toward health. Every ward would have high ceilings, large windows on both sides for cross-ventilation, natural light flooding every room. No patient room would be more than 20 feet from a window. The grounds would be expansive. Gardens, walking paths, farms where patients could work. Beauty was therapeutic. Nature was therapeutic. Order was therapeutic. The building itself would communicate hope. Kirkbride specified the maximum population, 250 patients, ideally closer to 200. Any larger, and the staff could not maintain the individual attention that moral treatment required. Any larger, and the asylum became a warehouse. This was not negotiable. By the 1850s, Kirkbride buildings were being constructed across America. The Athens Asylum for the Insane in Ohio, a masterpiece of Victorian Gothic architecture sprawling across 1,000 acres. Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia, completed in 1863, designed to house 250 patients in quarters that rivaled luxury hotels. Dozens more in Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois. Each one built on the same principles: beauty, order, therapeutic environment. Each one a monument to the belief that mental illness could be cured through proper care. State legislatures funded them eagerly. These were symbols of progress, of civilization, of America surpassing Europe. Newspapers praised them. Tourists visited them. Governors toured them. The asylums were temples to Enlightenment values made brick and stone. But there was a problem Kirkbride had not anticipated: demand. On a cold day in March 1841, Dorothea Dix walked into the East Cambridge jail to teach Sunday school to female prisoners. She was 39 years old, a former schoolteacher, unmarried, in fragile health, plagued by tuberculosis and what we might now call depression. She had been born in Maine to an abusive, alcoholic father and a chronically ill mother. Escaped at age 12 to live with her grandmother in Boston. Educated herself. Built a career teaching before illness forced her to stop. She was intelligent, driven, and restless. The jail visit was meant to be charitable, a way to fill her time. What she found there changed the course of her life. Among the prisoners, locked in unheated cells, were women who had committed no crime. They were mentally ill, confined with criminals because there was nowhere else for them to go. Unfed, unwashed, some naked because they had been given no clothing, no medical care, no oversight, no hope of release. Dix was horrified. She demanded an explanation from the jailer. He shrugged. Where else should they go? The almshouse was full. The asylum was full. The jail was all that remained. This was the system. Dix left the jail that day with a question burning in her mind. If this was happening in Cambridge, what was happening everywhere else? She decided to find out. Over the next 18 months, she traveled across Massachusetts, visited more than 300 jails, 18 state penitentiaries, over 500 almshouses. She documented everything. Men and women chained in cellars, in cages, in stalls meant for animals, beaten with rods, lashed into obedience, left in their own filth for days, weeks, years. Some had been confined for decades with no charges, no trial, no review, guilty only of being mad and poor. In January 1843, Dix presented a memorial to the Massachusetts legislature. She was a small woman, soft-spoken, proper in her dress and manner, but her words were fire. I proceed, gentlemen, briefly to call your attention to the present state of insane persons confined within this commonwealth in cages, closets, cellars, stalls, pens, chained, naked, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience. She did not ask. She demanded. The state had a responsibility to its most vulnerable citizens, not charity, responsibility. Mental illness was not a crime. It was a condition, a medical condition that could be treated. These people did not belong in jails. They belonged in asylums, proper asylums, following moral treatment where they could recover. The legislature was moved. Within months, they voted to expand the Worcester Insane Asylum. Dix did not stop. She moved on to Rhode Island, then New York, then New Jersey. Over the next 40 years, she would lobby 15 state legislatures, travel more than 10,000 miles by stagecoach in the 1840s alone. She was relentless. Her method was always the same. Document the horrors, present the evidence, shame the legislators into action. She was effective. By the time of her death in 1887, Dorothea Dix had directly influenced the founding or expansion of 32 mental institutions across the United States and Canada. She visited Europe, persuaded Pope Pius IX to personally inspect the atrocious conditions she had discovered in Italian asylums. She was, by any measure, the most successful advocate for the mentally ill in American history. But she could not control what happened after the asylums were built. The asylums that Dix championed were designed to heal. They followed the Kirkbride plan. They embraced moral treatment. They hired superintendents trained in the new philosophy. For the first few years, it worked. Small populations, individual attention, patients recovering and returning home. Success stories were documented, published, celebrated. But the success created a problem. Families heard that state asylums could cure mental illness. They brought their loved ones, demanded admission. Local governments heard that asylums could relieve them of burdens. They sent more patients, and they discovered a loophole. The elderly, the senile, those with dementia, if they were labeled insane, they could be transferred from county almshouses to state asylums. The financial burden shifted from local to state budgets. Suddenly, every confused old man became mentally ill. Every elderly woman with memory loss became insane. The asylums filled beyond capacity. Worcester, built for 250 patients, held 600 by the 1870s. Others held more than 1,000. The Kirkbride ideal was 250 maximum. That number was not arbitrary. It was the threshold beyond which individual attention became impossible. But states could not turn patients away. Once admission policies were established, they had to accept everyone who qualified. And the definitions of qualified kept expanding. Staff-to-patient ratios plummeted. Superintendents who had envisioned therapeutic communities found themselves managing overcrowded warehouses. Moral treatment required time, conversations, individual care plans, meaningful work tailored to each patient's abilities and interests. With hundreds of patients, this became impossible. Attendants were hired not for compassion, but for physical strength. Their job was not to heal, but to control. Restraints returned, not chains, but straitjackets. Isolation cells, forced sedation, the language of moral treatment remained. Annual reports still spoke of therapeutic environments, of recovery rates, of humane care. But the reality inside was changing. By the 1860s, the crisis was visible to anyone willing to look. But few were willing. The asylums had become too important. They employed hundreds. They defined towns. They represented state investment, state pride. Admitting failure was not an option. The Civil War interrupted everything. From 1861 to 1865, the nation's attention turned to survival. Asylums received less funding, lost staff to military service, took in soldiers returning with what would later be called shell shock or PTSD. Dorothea Dix herself left asylum work to serve as superintendent of army nurses, overseeing the training of more than 180 women to care for the wounded. She was 60 years old, tireless, uncompromising in her standards. When the war ended, she returned to asylum reform. But what she found devastated her. The institutions she had fought so hard to create had transformed. The beautiful Kirkbride buildings remained, but inside, the promise of moral treatment had died. Overcrowding, understaffing, patients left to languish. The asylums were no longer places of healing. They were holding pens. Dix continued her work until her health failed. In 1881, at age 79, she retired to an apartment in the Trenton State Hospital in New Jersey, the first asylum she had founded in 1848. She called it her firstborn child. She lived there until her death in 1887, witnessing daily what her life's work had become. The irony was bitter. She had liberated thousands from jails and almshouses, only to see them confined in asylums that became jails in all but name. She had believed that the state could be trusted to care for its vulnerable citizens. But states prioritized cost over care, control over compassion. The infrastructure she built would stand for another century. The buildings would house millions, but the healing she envisioned never scaled. By 1860, the contradiction was complete. The philosophy, individual attention, moral treatment, therapeutic environment. The reality, mass institutionalization, custodial care, permanent confinement. The numbers told the story. In 1840, there were a few thousand people in American asylums. By 1860, tens of thousands. By 1880, over 100,000. By 1904, 150,000. The growth was exponential, unsustainable. Every expansion of capacity created more demand. Every new asylum filled immediately and then overflowed. Superintendents requested more funding. Legislatures provided more beds, but never enough staff, never enough resources for actual treatment. The asylums became bureaucracies. The patients became numbers. Admissions increased. Discharges decreased. Length of stay grew from months to years to decades. Some patients would never leave. They would grow old within those walls, die within those walls, be buried in unmarked graves on asylum grounds. The promise of cure was abandoned quietly. No official declaration, just a slow collective recognition that it had been naive. Mental illness, the new consensus held, was largely incurable. Asylums existed not to heal, but to protect society from the mad and the mad from themselves. This was the new mission, unstated but understood. Custodial care, permanent warehousing, humane when possible, but never expecting recovery. The question Dix had asked, the question Pinnell and Tuke had asked, remained unanswered. What happens when the system designed to heal becomes designed to contain? The answer would unfold over the next century. In the massive state hospitals that would rise across America. In the treatments that would promise miracle cures but deliver devastation. in the lives of hundreds of thousands who would enter those doors and never return. The great American asylum experiment had failed before it truly began. Not because the philosophy was wrong, but because the scale was impossible. Because good intentions could not survive the mathematics of mass institutionalization. Because, in the end, the asylums were built not for the patients, but for everyone else. To remove them from sight, from conscience, from concern, out of sight, out of mind. The very phrase has origins in this era, a euphemism for abandonment disguised as care. The next 50 years would prove how deep that abandonment could go. By 1890, the numbers had become undeniable. In the United States, 150,000 people were confined in mental hospitals by 1904. In Germany, more than 400 public and private asylums operated. In Britain and France combined, the population of asylums had grown from a few hundred in the early 1800s to hundreds of thousands. The average asylum population in America had jumped 927% since mid-century. In France, institutions routinely held double their maximum capacity. The asylums had become nations unto themselves, cities of the mad, surrounded by walls, operating under their own rules, hidden from public view. What happened inside those walls over the next 60 years would be documented eventually, but for decades, the silence was nearly complete. The explosion of asylum populations had multiple causes, all converging at once. Industrialization was transforming society. Families moved from farms to cities. Extended family networks dissolved. There was no longer room, no longer capacity to care for a mentally ill relative at home. Urbanization concentrated poverty, made visible those who would have been hidden in rural communities. Immigration brought millions to America who spoke no English, understood no customs, had no support networks. Cultural differences were pathologized. Strange behavior was labeled insanity. The definition of mental illness expanded. What counted as insane grew broader each decade. Alcoholism became a mental disorder. Epilepsy, dementia in the aged, elderly. Even poverty and homelessness could qualify someone for commitment. The aged were transferred in massive numbers. In 1870, those 65 and older represented 29.3% of patients in state and county psychiatric hospitals. Local governments discovered they could shift the burden. An elderly person in an almshouse was a county expense. That same person, labeled senile or insane, became a state expense. The incentive was clear. By the 1890s, superintendents were overwhelmed. They had become hospital administrators, not healers. Their days were spent managing budgets, negotiating with legislatures, pleading for more staff, more space, more resources. They were not doctors anymore. They were wardens. And the reputation of psychiatry, which had briefly risen with the promise of moral treatment, collapsed. Psychiatry became a medical backwater, the specialty no one wanted, the hospitals no one visited except in desperation. Asylums were custodial institutions again, warehouses with a veneer of medical legitimacy. The dream had died. In an attempt to address the crisis, states began passing state care acts. New York led the way in 1890. The logic was straightforward. If the problem was lack of coordination, centralize control. Make the state, not counties and municipalities, responsible for funding and administering care for the mentally ill. Create regulatory structures, standardize practices, professionalize psychiatry. Other states followed: Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Illinois. The intent was reform, better quality through state oversight, economies of scale through centralized administration. The reality was different. Centralization removed local accountability. When asylums were run by county boards, local citizens could inspect, could complain, could demand answers. When they were run by distant state bureaucracies, they disappeared from view. The State Care Acts also solidified psychiatry's monopoly on treatment. Mental illness became exclusively a medical issue, to be handled in medical institutions by medical professionals. Families lost power to make decisions. Communities lost influence. The state decided who was insane. The state decided where they went. The state decided when, if ever, they could leave. And the state was overwhelmed. Funding never matched need. Staffing never matched population. Buildings deteriorated. Programs evaporated. The State Care Acts succeeded in one thing: making the problem invisible. The mentally ill were removed from jails and almshouses, as reformers had demanded. They were placed in massive state institutions, far from cities, surrounded by farmland, accessible only by long roads that discouraged visitors. Out of sight. The silence lasted until someone from inside spoke. His name was Clifford Beers. In 1908, he published A Mind That Found Itself, a first-hand account of his experiences in multiple mental institutions in Connecticut. Beers had been a successful businessman until his mid-20s, when he suffered what we would now call a psychotic break. He attempted suicide, was committed. Over the next 3 years, he was transferred between institutions, experienced different treatments, different staff, different philosophies. What he documented was not medicine, it was brutality, beatings by attendants who punched, kicked, strangled patients who disobeyed or complained. Straitjackets used not for safety, but for punishment, left on for days at a time until circulation was cut off, skin blistered. Isolation cells, dark and freezing, where patients were thrown for minor infractions or simply because staff wanted them quiet. Forced treatments, ice baths that left patients hypothermic, rotational therapy where they were spun until they vomited, then spun more. Induced vomiting through emetics that caused such violent retching that patients ruptured blood vessels. Starvation used as discipline. Foul food contaminated with insects or mold. No privacy. No dignity. No hope of release unless family could afford to take you home. Beers wrote with precision and restraint. He did not exaggerate. He named institutions, named individuals, provided dates. His credibility was unimpeachable. He had recovered, returned to society, was clearly rational, articulate, reliable. The book shocked the public, not enough to reform the system, not yet, but enough to plant seeds of doubt. Beers himself channeled his experience into advocacy. He joined with psychiatrist Adolf Meyer and psychologist William James to form the National Committee for Mental Hygiene in 1909. Their philosophy, mental illness had biological and pathological origins, linked psychiatry with neurology, biology, physiology, treat it as medical science, not moral failing. Focus on prevention. Early intervention. Stop mental illness before it became chronic. The mental hygiene movement, as it became known, was well-intentioned. But its focus on prevention meant resources went to research, to public education, to identifying and treating early cases, not to the hundreds of thousands already confined in deteriorating state hospitals. The existing patients, the chronic cases, the ones who had been institutionalized for years or decades, were written off as beyond help. The institutions holding them continued to decay. The Great Depression devastated asylum funding. State budgets collapsed. Appropriations for mental hospitals were slashed. Staff were laid off. Maintenance deferred. Food budgets cut. patients went hungry. Buildings crumbled. Violence increased as understaffed wards spiraled into chaos. Then came World War II. Every able-bodied staff member who could serve joined the military. Nurses, attendants, even some physicians. Who was left were the old, the unfit for service, the minimally trained. The asylums became holding pens. And into this desperation came new treatments, promising miracles. In the 1930s, insulin shock therapy was introduced. Patients were injected with massive doses of insulin, inducing hypoglycemic coma. The theory was that the shock to the system might reset the brain. It did not, but it made patients docile, easier to manage. In 1938, electroconvulsive therapy arrived, electrical current sent through the brain, inducing seizures. Originally developed in Italy, it spread rapidly to America. For some conditions, particularly severe depression, it showed genuine benefit. But it was also used as punishment, as behavioral control. Without anesthesia, without muscle relaxants, patients were held down while they convulsed, often breaking bones, biting through their tongues. Then came the lobotomy. In 1935, Portuguese neurologist Egas Moniz developed the prefrontal lobotomy. The procedure involved drilling holes into the skull and severing connections between the prefrontal cortex and the rest of the brain. The theory: mental illness resided in the frontal lobes. Disconnect them and symptoms would cease. Moniz reported success. Patients became calmer, less anxious, more manageable. In 1949, he received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. The procedure spread. In America, neurologist Walter Freeman modified it, creating the transorbital lobotomy, the ice pick lobotomy. Instead of drilling through the skull, Freeman inserted an ice pick-like instrument through the eye socket, just above the eyeball. He hammered it through the thin bone into the frontal lobe and swept it back and forth, severing neural connections. It took minutes, required no operating room, sometimes no anesthesia. Freeman traveled the country in a van he called the Lobotomobile, performing the procedure at institution after institution. He personally performed over 3,400 lobotomies. Other surgeons performed tens of thousands more. By 1951, approximately 40,000 Americans had been lobotomized. The results were predictable. Some patients became calmer. Many became vegetables, emotionless, unable to think, complexly, unable to care for themselves. Personality was destroyed, but they were easier to manage. That was the point. The lobotomy was not therapy. It was control, a permanent chemical restraint achieved through mutilation. Among the victims was Rosemary Kennedy, sister of John F. Kennedy. In 1941, at age 23, Rosemary underwent a lobotomy on the recommendation of doctors who promised it would calm her mood swings and erratic behavior. The procedure left her permanently incapacitated, unable to speak coherently, requiring full-time care for the rest of her life. Her family hid her away for decades. The Kennedys, one of America's most powerful families, could not protect her from the system. This personal tragedy would later influence policy. When JFK became president, his approach to mental health would be shaped by what happened to his sister. But that was decades away. In the 1940s, the lobotomy was seen as progressive, scientific, modern, a solution. In May 1946, Life magazine published an exposé titled Bedlam 1946. The photographs were stark, unavoidable. Naked patients in bare rooms, huddled on floors, staring at walls, overcrowded wards with beds inches apart. No privacy, no personal possessions, filth, decay, Despair. The article compared conditions to Nazi concentration camps recently liberated. America recoiled. These were not criminals, not prisoners of war. These were American citizens confined in American institutions on American soil. The same year, Congress passed the National Mental Health Act, creating the National Institute of Mental Health. It was a symbolic gesture, funding for research, for training professionals, for studying the problem, not for fixing the institutions. Those continued to overflow. By 1950, the asylum system reached its peak. Over 500,000 Americans were confined in psychiatric hospitals. The average length of stay was measured not in months, but in years, often decades. Many patients would never leave. They would grow old inside, die inside. Bethlem Royal Hospital in London, the institution that started it all in 1247, had buried over 20,000 bodies in unmarked mass graves on its grounds. American institutions followed the same pattern: potter's fields, anonymous graves, no markers, no names, the forgotten. Looking back from our perspective, it is easy to see the pattern. Every reform, no matter how well-intentioned, was swallowed by scale. Moral treatment worked for 50 patients, failed for 500. Beautiful Kirkbride buildings worked when uncrowded, became warehouses when overcrowded. State oversight worked in theory, failed when underfunded. New treatments promised cures, delivered control. The fundamental problem was never addressed. Society wanted the mentally ill gone, hidden, contained, not treated, not cured, certainly not integrated. Asylums served that purpose perfectly. They removed the disturbing, the frightening, the inconvenient from public view. Whether patients improved was secondary. Whether they suffered was irrelevant. As long as they stayed inside, the system was working, and they did stay inside. Admission was easy. Commitment laws allowed families, or even just physicians, to institutionalize someone against their will with minimal oversight. Discharge was nearly impossible. Once labeled insane, the label stuck. Patients had no legal rights, no voice, no recourse. They could petition for release. The petitions were almost always denied. They could write to family. Letters were often intercepted, destroyed. They could complain about treatment. Complaints were ignored or punished. The asylum was a one-way door. And by 1950, 500,000 people were locked behind it. The asylums had failed to cure, failed to care, failed to treat with dignity. But what was the alternative? That question haunted everyone who looked honestly at the system. You could not simply open the doors. Where would 500,000 people go? Most had been institutionalized for so long, they had no families, no homes, no skills for independent living. You could not fix the institutions. Decades of underfunding, overcrowding, and bureaucratic calcification had made them unreformable. You could not trust the system to police itself. The same administrators who allowed the abuses to happen would not suddenly become reformers. The problem seemed intractable, but history has a way of accelerating when pressures build beyond tolerance. The 1950s would bring changes no one anticipated. A chemical revolution, a cultural shift, a presidential vision shaped by personal tragedy. And within 2 decades, the asylum system that had stood for centuries would collapse, not because it was defeated, but because it simply emptied. The doors would open, the patients would leave, and then the question would become, where did they go? The revolution came in a pill bottle. In 1954, a pharmaceutical company in France released a drug called chlorpromazine. In America, it was marketed under the brand name Thorazine. It was the first effective antipsychotic medication. For the first time in human history, the symptoms of severe mental illness could be reduced without lobotomy, without restraints, without brutality. Hallucinations diminished, delusions faded, violent agitation calmed. Not for everyone, not completely, but for enough patients that the impossible suddenly seemed possible. What if the mentally ill did not need to live in institutions? What if they could be treated at home, in their communities, with medication and support? What if the asylums could be emptied? Thorazine was not a cure. It was a suppressant. It worked by blocking dopamine receptors in the brain, dulling the intensity of psychotic symptoms. But it came with side effects: weight gain, sedation, tremors. In some cases, a condition called tardive dyskinesia, involuntary movements of the face and body, that could become permanent. Still, compared to lobotomy, compared to insulin shock, compared to indefinite confinement, it was a miracle. Within months of its introduction, asylums across America began prescribing it. Patients who had been violent became calm. Those who had been unreachable became responsive. Wards that had been chaotic became manageable. For the first time, superintendents could imagine discharging patients, not cured, but stable enough to live outside. In 1955, just 1 year after Thorazine's introduction, Congress passed the Mental Health Study Act. It commissioned a nationwide analysis and re-evaluation of mental health care. The Joint Commission on Mental Illness and Health was formed, bringing together psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and policy experts. Their task: assess the current system and recommend changes. In 1961, they published their report, Action for Mental Health. The conclusions were damning. The state hospital system was a failure. Institutionalization itself was harmful, causing dependency, hopelessness, and deterioration even in patients who might have recovered. Modern treatment should enable patients to maintain lives outside institutions. Aftercare and rehabilitation were essential. The debilitating effects of institutionalization were real and documented. The report called for a fundamental shift from hospital-based care to community-based care. Build local mental health centers, provide outpatient treatment, keep people in their communities, close to family, and support networks. Reserve hospitalization only for acute crises, and then for the shortest possible time. It was a vision, a blueprint for transformation, but blueprints do not build themselves. On February 6, 1963, President John F. Kennedy addressed Congress. It was the first and perhaps only presidential message to Congress that dealt exclusively with mental health and mental illness. Kennedy spoke with unusual passion. "We need a bold new approach," he said. "Mental illness and mental retardation are among our most critical health problems. They occur more frequently, affect more people, require more prolonged treatment, cause more suffering by the families of the afflicted, waste more of our human resources than any other single condition." He proposed a goal: cut the population of mental institutions by half within a decade or two, from 600,000 to 300,000 or less. Replace the cold mercy of custodial care with the open warmth of community. Build 1,500 community mental health centers across the nation. Each would serve a catchment area of 75,000 hours to 200,000 people. Provide outpatient treatment, emergency services, partial hospitalization, consultation, and education. The federal government would fund construction. States would fund operations. The vision was comprehensive, ambitious, transformative. Kennedy's motivation was both political and personal. Politically, he recognized the unsustainable cost of the state hospital system, The public was demanding reform. The exposés of the 1940s had not been forgotten, but there was something deeper. Rosemary, his sister, her lobotomy in 1941 had destroyed her, reduced a vibrant young woman to someone who could barely speak, who would require full-time care for the rest of her life. The Kennedys had hidden her away, placed her in an institution in Wisconsin, rarely visited, rarely spoke of her. But the guilt, the shame, the knowledge of what had been done to her haunted the family. Kennedy's message to Congress was personal. He was proposing liberation not just for 600,000 strangers, but for people like his sister. On October 31st, 1963, Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Act into law. $150 million in federal grants for construction of community mental health centers. It was the last bill he would ever sign. 3 weeks later, on November 22nd, 1963, he was assassinated in Dallas. The vision was outlined, the legislation passed, but the president who championed it was gone, and the infrastructure promised was never fully built. The true catalyst for deinstitutionalization came not from vision, but from accounting. In 1965, Congress passed Medicare and Medicaid, fundamentally restructuring healthcare financing in America. Buried in the legislation was a provision that would reshape mental health care. Medicaid prohibited federal reimbursement to states for mental health treatment in facilities with more than 16 beds. The intent was to prevent the federal government from subsidizing the failed state hospital system. The effect was to create powerful financial incentives for states to close large institutions and move patients elsewhere. If a patient was treated in a state hospital, the state paid 100% of the cost. If that same patient was treated in a community setting, nursing home, or general hospital, Medicaid covered 50% of the cost. The calculation was simple. Deinstitutionalization would cut state mental health budgets in half. Governors and state legislatures, already struggling with the expense of maintaining crumbling state hospitals, seized the opportunity. Discharge patients, close wards, shutter entire buildings, shift the cost to the federal government through Medicaid. It was not therapy, it was cost shifting, but it accelerated deinstitutionalization beyond anything Kennedy had envisioned. In 1967, California Governor Ronald Reagan signed the Lanterman-Petris-Short Act into law. The LPS Act, as it became known, was framed as a civil rights protection. It prohibited involuntary commitment except under very specific circumstances. The person must be a danger to themselves, a danger to others, or gravely disabled and unable to provide for basic needs. Even then, commitment was limited. 72 hours for evaluation, 14 days for intensive treatment, additional time only with judicial review. The burden of proof shifted. The state had to demonstrate that commitment was necessary, not merely convenient. For decades, families and doctors had been able to commit people with minimal oversight, sign a form, have someone declared insane, lock them away indefinitely. The LPS Act ended that. It was a genuine reform, overdue. But it was also strategic. Reagan, like governors across the nation, faced massive budget deficits. California's state hospital system was hemorrhaging money. The LPS Act provided political cover, frame it as civil liberties, as protecting the rights of the mentally ill, then close hospitals. Reagan did not redirect the savings to community mental health centers. He diverted the funds to the state's general budget. California had promised to follow patients into the community, to build the support systems Kennedy had envisioned. Instead, they simply opened the doors. Other states followed California's example. By the early 1970s, deinstitutionalization was in full swing across America. The numbers tell the story. In 1955, state and county psychiatric hospitals held 559,000 patients. By 1970, that number had dropped to 339,000. By 1980, it was 154,000, a reduction of 72% in 25 years. It was the largest institutional migration in American history. Where did they go? Some went home to families who were unprepared, overwhelmed, terrified. Some went to nursing homes, where staff had no training in mental health care. Some went to board and care homes, often run for profit with minimal oversight. Some went to general hospitals for brief stays, then were released with no follow-up. And many went to the streets. The community mental health centers that were supposed to catch them never materialized at scale. Of the 1,500 centers Kennedy proposed, only about 700 were ever built, and those that were built focused on prevention and treatment of mild to moderate mental illness, not severe, chronic conditions. The seriously mentally ill, the ones who had spent years in institutions, were not their priority. Meanwhile, changes in civil commitment laws made it nearly impossible to force treatment, even on someone clearly in crisis. Families watched loved ones deteriorate, unable to intervene unless they became an immediate danger. Police became the frontline responders for mental health crises, untrained, unprepared, defaulting to arrest when no other option existed. By the late 1970s, the consequences were undeniable. Homelessness exploded. Tent cities appeared in urban centers. Jails and prisons filled with people whose primary problem was untreated mental illness. The seriously mentally ill were no longer in asylums. But they had not been liberated. They had been abandoned. In 1973, two events accelerated the collapse of the old system. First, the Supreme Court ruling in Sauder versus Brennan. The court held that patients in mental health institutions must be considered employees if they performed any work that conferred economic benefit on the institution. They must be paid minimum wage. For decades, asylums had relied on patient labor, farming, cooking, cleaning, laundry. It was framed as therapy, occupational therapy, part of moral treatment. But it was also free labor that kept institutions running. Suddenly, that labor had to be paid. States could not afford it. Institutions that had been financially marginal became financially impossible. More hospitals closed. Second, psychologist David Rosenhan published On Being Sane in Insane Places in the journal Science. The study was simple and devastating. Rosenhan and 7 Confederates, all perfectly sane, presented themselves at psychiatric hospitals claiming to hear voices. All were admitted. All were diagnosed with schizophrenia or manic depression. Once inside, they behaved normally. Told staff the voices had stopped. Cooperated fully. None were detected as frauds. Their hospital stays ranged from 7 to 52 days. Average 19 days. When finally released, they were not declared sane. They were declared in remission. The label, once applied, was permanent. Rosenhan's conclusion: psychiatric diagnosis was unreliable. Institutions could not distinguish the sane from the insane. The study was controversial. Critics pointed to methodological flaws. But the damage to public trust was done. If diagnosis was this unreliable, how many people had been wrongly committed, wrongly labeled, wrongly confined? The legitimacy of the entire system crumbled. By 1977, the failures of deinstitutionalization were impossible to ignore. President Jimmy Carter convened a new presidential commission on mental health. The Commission's report, published in 1978, was sobering. Community mental health centers had failed to serve those with serious mental illness. People with chronic conditions had been discharged from hospitals with no follow-up, no support, no plan. Families had been left to cope alone. The civil rights movement's emphasis on autonomy had left people who needed help unable to access it. The Commission called for a national mental health policy focused specifically on the chronically mentally ill. The National Institute of Mental Health responded by creating the Community Support Program. It allocated $3.5 million annually for states to provide services to adults with severe persistent mental illness. $3.5 million for a population of hundreds of thousands. It was a symbolic gesture, nothing more. By 1980, the asylums were empty, but the promise of community care had not been fulfilled. Kennedy's vision of 1,500 community mental health centers remained unrealized. The infrastructure to support deinstitutionalization had never been built. What had been built was a new system, unintended, unplanned, a system where the mentally ill cycled through jails, emergency rooms, homeless shelters, and brief hospital stays, where families bore impossible burdens, where police handled psychiatric crises with handcuffs because there was no alternative. The asylum system had been destroyed, but nothing coherent had replaced it. The chains had been broken, the doors had been opened. But freedom without support is not freedom. For some, deinstitutionalization meant genuine liberation, return to family, access to medication, ability to work, to live, to thrive. For others, it meant abandonment, homelessness, incarceration, suffering visible instead of hidden. The question that haunted the reformers of the 1790s returned with new urgency. Can kindness replace coercion? The answer, it seemed, was not simply yes or no. Kindness requires infrastructure. Community care requires community. Support systems require sustained funding and political will. Without these, freedom becomes cruelty of a different kind. The asylums were gone, but the problem remained. 500,000 people who had been locked away now needed somewhere to be, something to do, someone to help. Where did they go? The answer emerged slowly, over decades. Not in policy papers or academic studies, though those would come, but in the visible transformation of American cities, in the tent encampments that appeared beneath overpasses, in the booking records of county jails, in the emergency rooms of public hospitals, in the desperate calls from families who could find no help. The people who left the asylums did not disappear. They went somewhere. In 1983, Los Angeles County Jail became the largest mental health treatment facility in the United States. Not by design, by default. The jail complex, spread across multiple facilities in downtown Los Angeles, held approximately 3,000 inmates with serious mental illness on any given day. More than any hospital in California, more than any psychiatric facility in the country. They were housed in specialized units, but these were still jail cells, concrete, bars, constant noise, men screaming, officers shouting, metal doors slamming, fluorescent lights that never turned off. The treatment consisted of medication dispensed through slots in cell doors, 15-minute psychiatric evaluations once a week if you were lucky, group therapy in day rooms where violence could erupt without warning. Officers received minimal training in mental health crisis intervention. Most learned on the job, through trial and error, through watching colleagues get hurt. As state, Hospitals emptied throughout the 1970s, and community mental health centers failed to materialize at scale. People with untreated mental illness ended up on the streets. Behaviors that would have once led to hospitalization now led to arrest. Public disturbance, trespassing, petty theft, drug possession. The offenses were minor, but without treatment, without housing, without support, the cycle was relentless. Arrest, brief jail stay, release with no resources, deterioration, arrest again. By the 1990s, the pattern was national. Cook County Jail in Chicago, Rikers Island in New York. Every major urban jail system reported the same statistics. Between 21 and 80% of their populations had serious mental illness. Guards became de facto psychiatric nurses. Untrained, unprepared, resentful. Segregation units filled with people whose crime was psychosis. Some jails tried to provide treatment, hired psychiatrists, created specialized units. But jails are designed for punishment and containment, not therapy. The environment itself is traumatizing. The noise, the violence, the isolation. Mental illness worsens in jail, always. And upon release, there is still no housing, no medication, no follow-up. The cycle continues. In 2024, 3 of the largest mental health providers in America were jails: Los Angeles County, Cook County, Rikers Island. The irony was complete. Dorothea Dix had fought to remove the mentally ill from jails in the 1840s. By the 2000s, they had returned. But now, they were not just confined. They were criminalized. Arrest records that would follow them forever. Felonies that would prevent employment, housing, stability. The system had found a new way to warehouse those it did not want to see. Not in asylums hidden in the countryside. In prisons hidden in plain sight. Walk through downtown Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, Philadelphia. The homeless encampments stretch for blocks. Tents, tarps. Shopping carts piled with possessions, people talking to themselves, shouting at phantoms, withdrawn into catatonia. Estimates vary on how many homeless individuals have serious mental illness. Conservative estimates, 21%. Others suggest 50%. Some studies focused on chronic street homelessness find rates as high as 80%. The numbers are debated. The reality is visible. These are not people who chose homelessness. These are people for whom every support system failed. Many were discharged from state hospitals in the 1970s and 1980s with a bottle of pills and a bus ticket. Some had family initially, but families, overwhelmed and exhausted, eventually could not cope. Others aged out of foster care or juvenile systems with undiagnosed and untreated conditions. Still others developed mental illness in adulthood, lost jobs, lost housing, lost connections. On the street, mental illness accelerates. Trauma compounded by trauma, sleep deprivation, malnutrition, exposure to violence. Sleep becomes impossible. Every sound a potential threat. The cold concrete. The predators who circle at night. You close your eyes for a moment and your possessions disappear. Your shoes, your blanket, the medications you manage to hold on to. Paranoia that might have been manageable indoors becomes survival instinct outdoors. The voices that medications once controlled return with vengeance when pills are lost or stolen. Winter brings hypothermia, wet clothes that never dry, frostbite, pneumonia. Summer brings heat stroke, dehydration, infected wounds that fester. The police move you along. Every morning, every evening. You cannot rest, cannot stabilize, cannot think clearly enough to navigate the bureaucracies required to get help. The emergency room is the only refuge, but they discharge you after 72 hours. back to the street, back to the cycle. Self-medication through drugs and alcohol becomes survival strategy, which leads to addiction, which leads to more criminalization. The visible homeless population became America's new asylums. Open air, unregulated, lethal. Mortality rates among the homeless mentally ill are staggering. Death from exposure, from untreated medical conditions, from violence, from suicide. Average life expectancy on the streets, mid-40s to early 50s, 30 years shorter than the general population. The asylums were supposed to be places of safety, however flawed. The streets are not safe, but there is no room anywhere else. For those not in jail or on the street, there is a third path, the emergency room. Psychiatric crises now play out in hospital ERs across America. Someone in acute psychosis, brought by police or family, legally detained for evaluation. The ER physician assesses, determines the person is a danger to themselves or others, admits them to a psychiatric unit. If a bed is available, often it is not, so they wait. In the ER for hours, sometimes days. When a bed opens, they are admitted, stabilized on medication, usually within 72 hours to 2 weeks, then discharged. To where? If they are lucky, to family, with a prescription and an appointment at a community mental health clinic in 3 weeks. If they are unlucky, to a homeless shelter, or back to the street. Either way, without intensive support, deterioration is almost inevitable. They stop taking medication, side effects are intolerable, or they lose the prescription, or cannot afford to refill it. Symptoms return. Crisis returns. Back to the ER. This cycle, the revolving door, has become standard. Clinicians see the same patients repeatedly, know them by name, feel helpless, because the system is designed for acute intervention, not chronic support. A psychiatric hospitalization can stabilize someone in crisis, but it cannot provide housing, cannot provide community, cannot provide the ongoing structure and connection that recovery requires. So people cycle. ER to hospital to discharge, to crisis to ER. For years, for decades, until they end up in jail, on the street, or dead. There have been successes, small scale, underfunded, but real. Assertive community treatment teams, developed in the 1970s, provide intensive, wraparound services to people with serious mental illness. A team of clinicians meets the person where they are, at home, on the street, in jail, provides medication management, therapy, housing support, employment assistance. Studies show ACT teams reduce hospitalization, reduce homelessness, improve quality of life. But they are expensive, labor-intensive, serve small numbers. Most communities do not have them. Housing First initiatives, pioneered in cities like New York and Los Angeles, provide permanent housing without preconditions. No sobriety required, no medication compliance required, just housing. Then services are offered, not mandated. The model works. Stable housing is the foundation upon which recovery can be built. But it requires massive investment, political will, sustained funding, easier to promise than to deliver. Coordinated specialty care programs for first episode psychosis, developed in the 2000s, intervene early with young people experiencing their first psychotic break. Intensive support, family involvement, education and employment assistance. Results are remarkable. Many achieve full recovery, return to school, build careers, live independently. But these programs serve perhaps 5% of those who need them. For the other 95%, the system remains fragmented, inaccessible, inadequate. The Affordable Care Act of 2010 expanded Medicaid in many states, increasing access to mental health services. a genuine step forward. But expansion is incomplete, uneven, underfunded, and expanded access to outpatient therapy does not solve the problem of severe persistent mental illness requiring intensive support. We know what works. We lack the will to fund it at scale. Across America, the massive Kirkbride Asylums still stand. Athens Asylum in Ohio, a Victorian Gothic masterpiece, now houses an art museum. And ghost tours. Tourists pay to walk through the abandoned wards, hear stories of patients who died there, photograph the decay. The suffering has been commodified. Again, Trans-Allegheny in West Virginia operates similarly. Historic landmark, paranormal tourism. The irony is almost too heavy to bear. In the 1700s, Londoners paid to gawk at the mad in Bedlam. In the 2020s, Americans pay to gawk at the buildings where the mad suffered. Different centuries. Same impulse. Other asylums have been demolished, the land redeveloped, some converted to luxury apartments, condominiums, office complexes, the history sanitized, rebranded as historic charm. A few have been preserved with honesty. The Bethlem Museum of the Mind, at the current location of Bethlem Royal Hospital in Beckenham, confronts the institution's dark history directly. Exhibits on restraint devices, on treatment failures, on patient experiences. It does not celebrate. It witnesses. But most communities prefer forgetting to remembering. The buildings are razed, the graves unmarked, the stories untold, as if erasing the physical structures could erase the legacy. It cannot. For 779 years, from 1247 to 2026, Bethlem Royal Hospital has operated continuously. It is still there, still treating patients, no longer chained, no longer displayed. A modern psychiatric hospital, part of the South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust. What has changed? The methods, the medications, the philosophy. Patients have rights now, legal protections, ability to refuse treatment in most cases. The brutality is gone, the chains are gone, the public spectacle is gone. What remains the same? Society still does not know what to do with mental illness, still fears it, still stigmatizes it, still wants it out of sight. The mechanisms have changed, the impulse has not. We no longer build asylums, but we build prisons. We tolerate homelessness. We accept emergency rooms as psychiatric wards. We have not solved the problem. We have redistributed it, made it more diffuse, less visible, easier to ignore, until we encounter it directly. The man shouting at traffic, the woman asleep in the subway, the son who stopped taking medication and will not accept help. Then we remember, briefly, that the problem still exists, and we do not know what to do. The history of psychiatric asylums is a history of cycles, from family care to institutions, from institutions to communities, from communities back to streets and jails. Each era believed it had the answer. Moral treatment in the 1800s, medical treatment in the 1900s, community treatment in the 1960s. Each era failed those it meant to serve, not because the philosophies were wrong, but because funding never followed philosophy, because political will lasted a decade, not a century, because good intentions dissolved when confronted with cost. Pinnell removed the chains in 1797, but new chains were forged, straitjackets, lobotomies, overcrowding, neglect. Kennedy promised liberation in 1963, but liberation without support became abandonment. We know what people with serious mental illness need: stable housing, access to medication, therapy, community, connection, purpose, dignity. Not radical, not impossible, but expensive, long-term, unglamorous, easier to build a jail cell than supportive housing, easier to arrest than to treat, easier to look away than to invest, And so the cycle continues. Different forms, same failure. The human cost is incalculable. Millions of lives lost to suicide, to overdose, to exposure, to violence. Millions more lived in suffering that could have been prevented. Families destroyed by grief and exhaustion. Communities fractured by visible poverty and untreated illness. The financial cost is staggering. We spend billions on incarceration, on emergency room visits, on crisis response, far more than it would cost to provide stable housing and community support. But we spend it inefficiently, reactively, in ways that perpetuate the cycle rather than breaking it. The moral cost is perhaps highest. We are collectively failing the test that every society faces. How do we treat our most vulnerable? Our answer across centuries has been consistent. We confine them, we hide them, we forget them. We tell ourselves we are helping. We are not. In Raleigh, North Carolina, there is a building, a brand new 5-story prison hospital for inmates with severe mental illness. State-of-the-art, climate-controlled, modern medical facilities. It cost $120 million to build. Directly across the street stands another building, Dorothea Dix Hospital, opened in 1856, named in honor of the woman who fought to create it. Closed in 2012. Empty now. Windows boarded, grounds overgrown. The symmetry is devastating. We closed the asylum Dix built and built a prison to replace it. This is where we are. But there is another way. We know because we have seen it work. In places like Gould Farm in Massachusetts. 40 residents with serious mental illness live on a working farm in the Berkshires. It has operated since 1913, making it one of the oldest therapeutic communities in America. Residents aren't patients. They're community members. They wake at dawn to milk cows, feed chickens, harvest vegetables, work in the kitchen preparing meals for 60 people, run the farm store where they sell produce and baked goods to the public. There are therapists on staff, psychiatrists who visit weekly. But the healing comes primarily through routine, through purpose, through being needed. One resident, a man who had been hospitalized 17 times in 10 years, has been at Gould Farm for 4 years now. He manages the greenhouse, grows tomatoes, herbs, flowers. He has not been hospitalized once since arriving. Another, a woman with schizoaffective disorder, runs the baking program. She teaches new residents how to make bread, has published a cookbook. These are not exceptional cases. They are the norm when proper support exists. The model works. But it costs approximately $60,000 per resident per year. Most insurance won't cover it. Most families cannot afford it. They have purpose, community, structure, support. Many stabilize, some recover, some move on to independent living. It is not a cure, but it is dignity. It is not a hospital, but it is healing. This is what moral treatment actually looked like, not in theory, in practice, small scale, labor-intensive, expensive, but effective. The model cannot serve millions, not as it exists, but the principles can scale. If we choose to invest, housing first works, AKIT teams work, coordinated specialty care works. We have the knowledge, we lack the commitment. We stand at a crossroads familiar from history. The asylum system failed. We closed it. The community system failed. We never fully built it. The prison system is failing. We keep expanding it. What comes next is a choice. We can continue the cycle, build more jails, tolerate more homelessness, accept more suffering. Or we can learn from 779 years of history, from Bethlem to Bicêtre, to Athens, to Trans-Allegheny, to Los Angeles County Jail, from Peter Taverner to Philippe Pinel, to Dorothea Dix, to John F. Kennedy. from chains to lobotomies, to medication, to incarceration. The lesson is clear. Institutions without humanity fail. Freedom without support fails. Good intentions without sustained investment fail. What is needed is simple to state, hard to achieve. Housing, medication, therapy, community, purpose, and the political will to fund it. Not for a decade, for generations. To value care over cost. To see people, not problems. To recognize that mental illness is not a character failing, but a human condition requiring human response. We know this. We have always known this. The question is whether we will finally act on it. The priory of St. Mary of Bethlehem was founded in 1247. Today, in 2026, Bethlem Royal Hospital still operates in Beckenham, South London. 779 years of continuous service. The oldest psychiatric institution in the world. What has changed? Everything and nothing. The chains are gone. The public spectacle is gone. The brutality is gone. Patients receive evidence-based treatment, medication, therapy, support. Many recover. Many leave. Many build lives. But some do not. Some remain chronically ill, needing long-term care. And society still struggles with the question, what do we owe them? The answer given in 1247 was sanctuary. The answer given in 1403 was chains. The answer given in 1797 was compassion. The answer given in 1963 was community. The answer given in 2026 is still unwritten. We have torn down the asylums, but we have not yet built what should replace them. The people who once lived in institutions now live everywhere and nowhere. In jails, on streets, in emergency rooms, in families stretched to breaking. Visible now, undeniable now, the question posed at the beginning remains. Where did everyone go? The answer is, they are here, among us, around us, part of us, not hidden anymore, waiting for us to decide what we will do. Peter Taverner walked through Bethlem in 1403, stealing from 6 men who could not defend themselves. His theft was exposed, his corruption documented. But the pattern he represented endured. For 623 years, we have been stealing from the mentally ill, not their possessions, their autonomy, their dignity, their humanity, their hope. Different methods, same theft. The asylums are gone, but we have not yet learned how to care. Until we do, the chains remain, invisible now, but no less real.